Thanks, everyone, for being here today. Panelists, let's come on out here. Thanks for being with us for our international hour today. I think it's really important that, like Drew said, we have this cultural exchange. And we don't only focus on the United States. We're only one nation in the world, but sometimes it seems like Americans think that there is only one nation in the world. And, it's good that we remind people at conferences like this that that is not the case. So I'd love to, just introduce this all-star panel to you guys now. Right next to me, we have Senator Francisco Garcia Cabeza de Vaca. He's a senator from the state of Tamaulipas.
There you go.
In Mexico. And where is that regionally in Mexico for people who don't know?
It's right on the border with Texas. We have 17 border crosses with the United States. It's the northern part of Mexico and the south of Texas.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, moving on down the line, we have a representative from Texas. Bill Magnus is the president and CEO of ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, an institution I'm sure all of you know very well. He'll be talking from the perspective from here in Texas today. Thanks for being with us today, Bill. Sure. Absolutely. Next to him, we're going to go up a little bit north to my native stomping grounds in the Midwest. And we've got Commissioner Nick Wagner. He's a member of the Iowa Utilities Board, the board that regulates all of the public utilities in Iowa. Thanks for being with us today, Nick.
Thank you.
And to his left, we've got our only representative from off of the North American continent, Mr. Ron Weiss. He's the Senior Vice President of Engineering, Projects, and Business Development at the Israeli Electric Corporation. Thanks so much for being with us as well.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to stop talking now and give these guys a little bit of time to kind of just give you their short elevator spiel about what's going on in their industries and, in their regions and what their role is in it. So, Senator, I would love if you could just start us off and give us a little bit of an idea of, what's going on in all of these Mexican reforms that are going on right now in the energy sector and what your role is in with it.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. I'm really glad to be here in Texas. I feel like at home. I'm one of the few legislators that was involved with this new energy reform in Mexico. As a matter of fact, Mexico energy reform was approved by Congress in 2014, which changed the oil and electric industry after 75 years of national control, making it possible for the private sector to invest, participate, and benefit from the process. In 2014, there was over 20 laws that were either reformed or created but were officially published by Define Mexico's reform. They contemplate a long-term sustainable development for the energy sector because they include and regulate the following: environment protection, the development of Mexico's national industry, the open participation of the private, foreign, and national investments, the development of clean energies, new laws on landing, transparency of information, and fair compensation for the landowners that might be affected. In summary, this reform is promoting a more dynamic and competitive economic sector, as well as guaranteeing the supply of energy resources, which have been an important pillar of Mexico's economy. Just so you know, over 90% of Mexico's energy resources come from hydrocarbons, 75% from oil, 20% of natural gas, and the rest from the liquid gases. Now, private investors are now regulated with clean rules to avoid the management or to avoid corruption. Companies that are successful in bidding of contracts. From the beginning, they have been regulated through an open solicitation process, which has been guaranteed fairness for all participating companies. In other words, what we're trying to do is let you know all the opportunities that we have in the energy sector now in Mexico after 75 years of control of the state. Mm-hmm. Now the private companies will be able to invest in oil and gas and also in the electric sector and the country, Mexico.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Senator. I want to return to these reforms in a little bit in this conversation and talk about some of the unbundling that's going on, because I think it relates to a lot of the deregulation that happened, up here in the United States around 20 years ago.
Right.
But we can get to that in a little bit.
Sure.
I want to turn to Ron next, our other international representative here. Ron, Israel is half a world away for a lot of people here, but are you seeing a lot of the same trends in the electricity industry that we're seeing here? And if not, what are you seeing?
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to this conference and the panel. Everything was excellent. About Israel, it's really far away from here. I drove here more than 24 hours. Israel, the Israel Electric Company was established 93 years ago. For more than 70 years, we have a franchise, and we work with it. Around 20 years ago, Israel government decided to make a reform. She's trying to do it for the last 20 years with no success. The unions are very strong in Israel. And we are still the only utility in Israel. There were some IPPs that were connected to the net in the last years, around 2,000 megawatt out of 15,000 megawatt of the installed capacity in Israel. So there are some IPPs working, and it made the change. But still, we are the only utility. We are responsible not only for generation, but also transmission, distribution, etc. We have around 2.5 million customers. Most of the energy is now produced on gas. 10 years ago, there were some discoveries of gas offshore, Tamar, and in the future also Leviathan. These are the names of the discoveries of the gas. And we are producing around 60% each day on gas these days. We still have 5,000 megawatts on coal, but because of the regulation, we have to install FGD. We will talk about it later, of course. And this is the situation now in Israel. We face, I think, the same problems as in the States with the smart grid needs and with distributed energies, etc. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview, Ron. I think we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of what has happened with the reforms and stuff like that in a bit. Bill, can we turn to you next? You're our native Texan here. Can you give just a short overview for folks who maybe aren't from here? Just kind of what's going on with ERCOT and kind of the issues and trends that you're seeing.
Sure, I'd be happy to. As Gavin mentioned, probably a lot of you here in Austin are familiar with ERCOT. With a grid operator for most of Texas for about 90% of the electric demand or load, about 75% of the land mass. There are other organized markets in ERCOT. A portion of Texas, or rather in Texas, a portion of Texas is MISO, the Mid-Continent ISO, and a portion is in Southwest Power Pool. ERCOT fundamentally was delegated a key role in most of the aspects of the restructuring of the Texas electric market in 1999. It made a big change in what ERCOT did and its role. And the key things that the legislature did then were, one, create a retail market in the parts of the state that are not cooperative or municipal utilities, and that's about 75% of the load. And ERCOT plays a role in managing the switches and making sure those are done without any sort of competitive problem and are done efficiently. And we see almost 1 million switches of retail customers every year in the ERCOT system, and well over 90% of customers have switched at some point or another since deregulation. Then in the wholesale market, ERCOT plays the role of the reliability coordinator, the grid operator. Wholesale power in Texas is provided by deregulated companies, whether they be gas, coal, nuclear, wind, solar, lots of different companies, as well as the municipal and cooperative players who own generation. So that market is managed by ERCOT on a 24/7 basis. And we introduced a nodal market back in 2010, so it was running with the efficiency that brings into the system. And in addition, one of the key things the legislature did was ensure that the national policies that we're developing around open access to transmission were played out in Texas and maintained. One of ERCOT's roles is making sure that generation interconnection is non-discriminatory, and we do transmission planning. One of the key things that's happened in Texas, I know a lot of folks are aware of as we talk about renewables, was another act of the legislature a few years after the restructuring was to authorize the competitive renewable energy zones, which built thousands of miles of transmission, which essentially bridged the gap between wind resources, which were largely in West Texas, to the population centers where the load lives. And that was an enormous investment authorized by the legislature that was a real game changer for how we operate and the ability of renewable resources to come into the state. So we play a role in each one of those, and the sort of structure of the market was laid down in 1999 by the legislature. Lots of market changes, lots of new discussions of issues that we'll talk about in more detail, but I think that key structure has let ERCOT develop into a very dynamic market really at every level, from the consumer up to the generation developer and the transmission system.
Thanks so much, Bill, for giving us a great overview of you could call it almost the Republic of Texas, right? Because ERCOT is such an island down here. Fantastic. Commissioner, I want to turn to you next. We've got a lot of similar issues going on up in Iowa, but of course you're in a different organized market. You have some different resources going on there. Can you give the folks out there an inkling of what's going on up in Iowa?
Sure. And to start off, thank you very much for having me. For those of you who don't know, the Iowa Utilities Board is effectively the commission. In other states, they're called commissions. We just like to be different in Iowa, so we're called board. So I'm the one that everybody's been pointing the finger at over the last few days that I'm blocking all of the growth in this moving into these things. But Iowa's been very progressive from that standpoint. We've had energy efficiency programs on the books in law for over 20 years. We've got significant wind resources. Depending on whether you're looking at percentage or not, we're either number 1 or number 2 with Texas. We'll promise not to duke it out here, but but when you look at percentage, we're number 1.
Don't make me come over, guys. Don't make me come over there.
In fact, I think it was just last week that we went over 30% load in wind. So. We've been able to do that through the help of the organized market. We couldn't do that by ourselves. I think ERCOT is large enough that they've got the diversity across the size of Texas. We have MISO, which helps us do that. So it's been primarily done by utility scale. Utilities have done it, and we're over 6 gigawatts of installed wind. We have not seen a tremendous spike in the individuals doing DER, primarily because we have relatively low rates. Our average rate is anywhere from 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, all combined. So that makes the economics for an individual a little more difficult to do an individual PV or any other system. Some of the other systems that we're seeing going in, we've got more pigs than people in Iowa. So as you can imagine, they have a little bit of methane. Yeah. So we've got a lot of biodigesters and some of those systems that are looking at capturing that stuff and using it to create electricity. Some of those work really well, some of them don't. It takes quite a few pigs to make enough methane to make that work. So those are some of the things. We're in the process at the board of looking at DER from a standpoint of, because we don't have the individual penetration at this point, we think it's a good time to sort of lay the ground rules so that we can move forward and everybody knows what the rules are moving forward, so we don't have a situation where sometime down the road we're like, well, we're going to go ahead and change the rules, and everybody that's got it now, well, we don't know what to do with. We really don't want to go into the same situation that Nevada is having right now. So that's a little bit about what's going on in Iowa, and look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Commissioner. Just as a little point of curiosity here, is there a carve-out in your RPS for biofuels and biogas like that? Or is this happening are they trying to do it just kind of on the open market here?
Well, we do have an RPS.
Right.
But it's 105 megawatts. So effectively, it's nil.
It's been met already.
Yeah, like I said, we got 6 gigawatts of wind.
Yeah.
So we do have some tax credits, some state tax credits that do carve-outs for smaller wind installations, for some of the biodigesters, and some of those things.
Okay.
But as far as the RPS is concerned, we effectively may have not even have one.
Okay, I just point of curiosity.
But we do get lumped in when you see things of states that have it, and,
of course,
some people
You're on the
people
map.
point to that and say, oh, that's why you have so much wind, and we're like, no, I think we're in a windy area, in the western part of Iowa, and we've got a couple of utilities that have figured out how to do it really well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I want to turn back to our international contingency here, and you, Senator. I'd love if we could talk a little bit deeper about the Mexican energy reform. From what I understand, like you had, pretty much a vertically integrated state-owned utility before. Right. They own generation, transmission, distribution, everything. And part of this thing is, part of the reforms is to unbundle this. So you'll still have from my understanding, a state-owned, generation entity, transmission, distribution, all of these things. But now also private players can play in the market as well. Can you give us a little bit more detail than what I can?
Sure. This has been open for the privates. As a matter of fact, last week, CFE, which is the Federal Commission for Energy, had opened a bid for the wind energy producers so they can create these new plants and then sell the energy to the Federal Commission. These had not been happening for the last 75 years. That's one of the issues that are going on and the opportunities that the private companies have in Mexico right now, that they can invest in the clean energy and then sell it to the CFE, even though they still have control of the distribution, of the transportation. It's open to the private as well.
Okay, and the CFE, for people who don't know, is?
Comisión Federal de Electricidad, which is the Federal Commission of Electricity in Mexico, is owned by the government. But before, no private investors could intervene in that. But now, after this reform, any private sector can be involved.
Very interesting. And I think you had a pretty big role in kind of orchestrating or at least facilitating this energy transition. Can you tell the audience a little about that?
Sure. There were a few legislators that got involved in this energy reform. We have been trying to make this reform for the last 12 years, but by political matters, they stopped it. It was until 2013 and that the Congress, with the federal government, decided to make this reform and get open for the private sector. And now it's not only in the electric area, but also in the gas and oil. The private sector has been involved. What we're trying to do is make sure countries like the United States, especially people like in Texas that have a lot of experience in that technology. Yeah, I'm talking about extracting the oil and gas, get involved in the state like Tamaulipas, which has a lot of oil and gas areas to be explored and explored.
Very interesting, very interesting. Ron, I want to turn to you next. Can you give us a little bit more detail about the reforms that the Israeli electricity system has undergone and kind of what the outlook is now?
Okay, as I mentioned, 20 years ago, the Israeli government tried to do a reform. The purpose was to unbundle everything, generation apart, transmission apart, etc. They are trying to do so for 20 years. Now they understand they must focus on the generation side. And IPP were coming into the net, let's say, 5 years ago. And there are some IPPs that are already working around 2,000 megawatt. And the next step will be to take the ISO out of my company, out of IEC, in order to be very equal between all generation parts. And this is the big step. There are some union objectives, and it is difficult to do so. But I think it will happen, if not this year, maybe next year. Israel is an island concerning electricity. It is not connected to any other neighbors. And the situation is rather tough. You cannot make any mistake, because if something will not work in Israel, there will be no electricity to the citizens. And it can be very serious. It is not only a matter of convenience, but also a matter of safety, because we have from time to time tense situation with the neighbors. So electricity is very important in Israel. So the government has to take measure steps in order to be on a safe ground and be sure that everything will work very good.
Indeed, and electricity is certainly an important resource for the Palestinian population as well.
Yes.
You know, I wonder, so you're saying that the kind of the push now is to get the Israeli Electric Corporation out of the generation sphere? I kind of missed it.
No, the ESO, the control room, the
yes.
control of...
okay.
Okay.
Out of the control room, and give that to a separate entity like
Yes.
like someone like ERCOT or an ISO, something like that?
It will be a government company of some kind that will control the transmission, will control the generation of IEC, of the utility, and of the private sector all together with all the correct rules, equal to everyone. This is a huge step. It is important. We hear from time to time from the IPPs that the ISO staying inside the company is not working very equally to their side, so it is important for them that the control of all the generation will be out of the utility.
Ah, I see.
So this is the next step.
Ah, very interesting, very interesting. And you say that could happen in the next few years if the politics is right?
I think it will happen this year or the latest next year, sorry.
Ah, very interesting. Very interesting. We'll watch for that. So, you know, our American contingency, you know, these guys are in the midst of kind of a similar electricity reform to what we saw in the United States and many states about 20 years ago, right? Unbundling, you know, obviously we don't have as much federal government ownership here as in other countries, but do you guys have any, you know, lessons learned or, you know, things that you would like to say to them, like don't make this mistake or make sure you do this as you go into, you know, as they kind of go into the weeds of electricity reform here?
If I can add something before they start, we learned from California what happened in California a few years ago.
Didn't we all?
Lots of people learn from California.
Yes. So when the government tried to push and push to reform, and then happened what happened in California, so the union got a lot of information and started to maybe think once again about not doing a reform and keep IEC as the only utility in Israel.
So the California crisis not only stalled deregulation in the United States, but also in Israel?
Yes, of course.
Oh, man.
Sorry.
Well, indeed. Well, I'll turn it over to you guys. Any other lessons learned?
I think what you want to do is look at what works for the right places, and you know, you need to figure out what's going to work for each of your countries, because that's effectively what we did in the United States. And so in Iowa, we started down the path of deregulation again. And much like you guys, California kind of put everybody back on their heels. So there's a few things that we did, not to go to full deregulation, but we incorporated advanced rate making. So an entity can come in to the board and request if they're doing a generation plant, which includes wind, and this is also partially why we, I think, have done so much wind. But that gives them certainty and opportunity. So they can come in and they'll know what their ROE is at the end. It's effectively a small rate case for just that generation component. And then whatever, you know, the board has set for those in that particular case then follows with the life of the plant. So that gives utilities certainty to build generation. So that was one of the changes, I guess, if you want to call it compromise of going full dereg versus staying vertically integrated. We are still vertically integrated. We added a couple things that allow for, in a rate case, future costs. If you know, based on your test year plus 9 months, you can show that cost will be there and used and useful within that 9 months past the test year date, so that, you know, there's somewhat of a future cost to help with regulatory lag and some of those things. So those are some of the things that came about of kind of like I said, a compromise on going full board.
Yeah,
but you know, and I think you know, in places like Texas and Illinois, dereg has worked well. So you just got to kind of look at your system and pick the good things of each of the states, and maybe take lessons from the things that didn't go so well in the States.
So I wonder, just as a follow-up, is that kind of compromise, because we see that all throughout MISO, right? You have independent power producers, but you also have vertically integrated utilities that own generation, like the whole system, right? Is that sort of compromise to keep the vertically integrated utilities? Did that happen in other states around MISO as well, and that's why you see that there? Or I was just always curious about, why the market structure there still had vertically integrated utilities where like PJM, ERCOT don't.
Well, I think much like I said, each state kind of went at it their own pace, and California did. The situation in California did have a big impact. I think it's just a matter of, and really the ISOs sort of came about at that same time frame or a little bit afterwards. So then I think it's just a matter of the ISOs looking at it, and as a state, in a utility in a state. You've got to determine, okay, is that going to be the right move for me? Is that going to be helpful? Mm-hmm. Is it going to be more efficient for my customers? Some of those things. So I think that's more what states look at, is that ability. Like I said, we couldn't have the wind resources we have without the resource of MISO to absorb excess capacity when the wind is blowing, and to provide capacity when it's not blowing.
Sure. Well, Bill, I want to turn to you. ERCOT in the past has been, shall we say, one of the more lively markets in the United States when it comes to, pricing and things like that. It seems like you guys have, put in some controls, though, to kind of smooth out the peaks and troughs and make things a little bit more manageable. Could you speak to that and maybe some lessons learned for, our international contingency here about, how to make things work properly?
Sure. I think a lot of what we see in the reforms in Mexico are on that track, and I described this earlier for Texas. I think the move to separate the lines of business, the transmission, the generation, and treat them differently, where one is, in Texas, transmission distribution is still fully regulated, generation is not. Making those decisions early on and making sure there's political consensus for them and sticking with them has been a big issue for us, and I think a lot of the success. Now, you run into challenges. I think that there was not legislation filed, but discussed at our last legislative session by one of the transmission companies about, well, what do we do with storage? Can that be on the transmission side? Does that need to be on the generation side? Those issues, as technologies arise, will come up, but you've got a framework to deal with them in. The second part, and this may be fairly obvious, I'll tell you two things that are obvious. One is, don't expect that you can run over anybody. I think one of the things that's worked well in Texas is the stakeholder process that was set up from really dictated by the legislature on down, included every major player in our process. I mean, our ERCOT's board includes stakeholder representatives from generation, from transmission, from consumers, from industrial consumers, from residential and commercial consumers. And so finding some sort of process where you can develop enough consensus so that when people walk away, they feel like they've been heard, makes a big difference, because lots of people can go to the Capitol and ask for things to be revisited. So the more you take care of that in the process, the better. The second obvious thing is it is worthwhile to sweat the details. I think that's, my understanding. I was not involved in it, but I think some of the issues in California and other markets that have had challenges, and it's been here too, were just, did we think through this enough? Did we really align the incentives correctly? Think about people who would be thinking outside the box and how they would play with this system. Thinking about that stuff ahead, because as everybody in the industry knows, this is an extremely technical, challenging industry to work in. And so it kind of comes back to that, setting up that process for discussion so that you've got as many smart people thinking about it as you can before you make a decision.
Fantastic. I want to turn to a subject that is always talked about a lot here, and that is decarbonization, moving towards a lower carbon and eventually, hopefully, a zero carbon grid. Obviously, in the United States, we have the Clean Power Plan, which many people are taking cues from now, despite the delay. And we're also a signatory to the COP21 agreement that was signed last year in Paris. So, while there is political contention about global warming, I think, from my reporting, what I see is the power sector sees the writing on the wall. Senator, I want to turn to you next and ask, you said your electricity system today is heavily based on hydrocarbons. And you talked about, other companies from Texas oil and gas companies coming down and exploiting the resources down here. But what about Is the energy reform down in Mexico going to create new opportunities for renewable resources? And what is the government policy down there when it comes to taking carbon off the grid?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there was an agreement made by the federal government by the year 2024. 35% of
renewables.
the renewables has to be renewables. So in other words, we're in a hurry. Yeah. We need to get involved. We're changing the plants that are producing electricity by gasolines and transform them to gas. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing as well is promoting the investors of the wind electricity sector. Mm-hmm. And that in the short run, we'll be able to get that goal. Mm-hmm. It's not easy. There's a lot of money has to be involved, invest in that area. And that's the way we're going to contribute to lower the carbon.
The hydrocarbons. Yes,
exactly.
Indeed. I wonder, Mexico, everyone talks about it's a sunny place in most places. You know what I mean? Do you guys have pretty good solar potential down there? And have you seen interest in people, this is, the electricity system's deregulating, we can come in. Are people knocking on your door yet?
Yes, they are. As a matter of fact, there's a few companies that are willing to invest in areas like in the state of Sonora, Baja California. As a matter of fact, they're investing right now. And that's going to help as well to meet our goal by 2024. So the solar plants are going to take place as well in Mexico.
Oh, wow. And just as a kind of a point of context, if you ever look at the solar potential maps that NREL puts out, Baja California is the very top. It has some of the best potential in the world. It's always sunny down there. So I would always thought, they should put some solar farms down there. It's nice to hear that they are actually doing it. Very, very interesting. Thank you. Ron, I want to turn to you next and kind of say the same question. Obviously, we're all talking about decarbonization around the world. What's going on in Israel?
Okay, first of all, I think we have the same weather as California and the same beautiful beach and the same lovely ladies, of course. But certainly, our government goals is to work as much as possible on gas. After the discoveries of gas, they have decided to implement as much possible gas power plant as possible. We are working now day by day more than 60% on gas. Mm-hmm. And because we have only one gas connection, it is a little bit dangerous. You have to take care of the security of supply, and if something will happen with the gas pipeline, so we will be in trouble. So we try to keep not more than 60%, even though from time to time we go above 60%. About the coal power plants, we still run them. Mm-hmm. Lately, the government has decided to reduce 15% of coal power plant produce, and we are implementing this year. And there is a big debate in Israel about the coal power plants. From one perspective, we should reduce the power from coal power plants. But coal power plants will be the best way to deal with the waste in Israel, because waste will be burned in the coal power plant. Mm. So there are some, let's say, environmental issues that can be addressed and brought and find a solution with the coal power plant, and they are still at the moment running. Mm-hmm. We have very good sun, a lot of PV. The objective of the government is that 20% will be solar until the year of 2020. We are reaching there very fast. But as you know, solar can drive some problems. Last summer we had one day that a cloud went out of over Israel, mm-hmm. and all the production from solar was going down. And ISO was not really prepared for this, and it was a real tough situation. We have to keep enough spinning reserve in the machines in order to deal with such occasions. We have to come with solution of energy storage at the future, etc. So this is the situation.
Fantastic. And do you plan on having all of these gas plants out there? They can help you integrate that renewable resource as it comes online, right? Because they can ramp up and down a little bit more. Is that part of the idea as well?
Yes, but one of the problems is that the dynamic response of the combined cycle is much worse than the, let's say, steam turbines. Mm-hmm. So it is still important to have some steam turbines in the grid in order to deal with interference and short circuits and problems of other units that will stop to work. So you need, I think, several steam units in the grid in order to stable the system mm-hmm. and to ensure the supply to all the citizens.
Very interesting. Well, Bill, I want to turn to you next because ERCOT, it seems like you guys would have something to say about this because you almost regularly now go above 40% wind penetration here. Of course, you are not as small of an island as Israel is in an electricity system, but you are an island as well. What are some of the ways that you guys have come up with strategies to deal with this issue of intermittent renewables and integrate them, in the way you have, which has been, at least from what I've read, pretty mm-hmm. successfully.
Yeah, I think our latest was 48%.
Yeah.
Of load for one period just a few days ago. We keep having to change that record slide because
I keep having to write new articles about it.
But it's created a lot of challenges, and Ron, identified some of the most simple ones. The cloud comes over, the wind stops blowing. I mean, that is the challenge of intermittency. I think since we've had a lot of wind coming on the system and then knew we would have a lot more with the CREZ transmission lines developing, we've been working on this for several years, and after some bumpy efforts, I think a few things are really critical. One is getting as sophisticated as you can possibly be on forecasting, which forecasting wind and forecasting cloud cover is challenging. Ask the weatherman, right? But we have brought on a weatherman. We have a meteorologist that works for ERCOT now that looks at those things. We do longer term wind, and we're getting into a longer term, like 7-day solar forecast. So forecasting, and then sort of the general topic of situational awareness, having the tools available in your control room, so you are getting as much information as quickly as you can, and just thinking about it as part of the mix every day. We've been working with our market participants on ideas about are there market changes, like changes to ancillary services. We've changed our ancillary service methodology mm-hmm. to respond to this in the past, and are looking at additional potential changes in that area. So it's a kind of a combination of how you run your market, the tools you can bring to bear on predicting as much of the intermittency as you can, and then having the resources in place for, as you said, to be able to ramp up and ramp down, mm-hmm. and having those available and being able to compensate them appropriately.
Sounds like a lot of learning by doing.
It's been, and one of the things we took on that was challenging was what is the obligation of the wind generator when it comes on the system? I mean, reactive power requirements, primary frequency response requirements. There's a lot of these things are sort of unusual when they're applied to different types of resources. But we took that on with a lot of effort and challenge, kind of got to a place that folks could live with. Just recently FERC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on that same topic of saying, should we be applying some of these rules to some of those resources? And I think so, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention, I guess. Is that right? Something like that?
Yeah, absolutely.
That we had those things coming on the system. We had to account for them, and so we continue to work on it.
Fantastic.
Well, and the key point, I think you bring up a key point that people maybe don't think about, but the frequency response of a wind, whether it's a single generator or a system, is possible. Mm-hmm. But nobody's doing it because we have a conflicting policy that says we'll pay you for as much as you can produce. And so until we can line those things up, some of the problems that maybe wind and renewables have been, kind of their finger has been pointed at them, they can be fixed, but it takes a policy change. Yeah. And there's some incongruencies there that need to be addressed. And by the way, that's not the fault of the regulators, even though that's what everybody's been blaming it on the last 2 days. That's the legislators and Congress. They have to take care of that one. Senator, get on that.
Yes.
Well, if Senator Cabeza de Vaca was in our Congress, I think things might work a little bit more smoothly, right?
More flexible.
More flexible, indeed, indeed. You know, we could talk about renewables integration all day, but we're like reaching the point where my technical knowledge is at its limit. So let's change the subject. But something just to, it's just something very related, which is distributed energy resources, right? So we have, you know, a lot of states in the nation. I was in Hawaii a couple weeks ago talking to them about, you know, I drew the short straw, you know, but talking to them about how they're integrating their distributed resources. They've got, you know, dozens of feeders at midday feeding back into the grid because of all of this distributed solar that they've got out on the system. Some of the California utilities have some same issues, some similar issues. You're seeing things in Arizona and I think Texas. How much solar do you guys have in the interconnection queue? It's like 1.5 gigs.
And for utility scale, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so not distributed, but in any case. I'm wondering from you, Senator, you talking backstage, you said it was a little bit more in the early phases for distributed energy there, but do you see much potential for it in Mexico? And,
Yes.
And what are some of the trends you're seeing around it?
Well, to start with, like I said, the plants are being converted from gasolines to gas. We have a lot of gas underground, and we have a lot of potential in that. That will lower the cost of producing the energy. And the private sector is getting involved in this transformation of these plants. Also, regarding the wind electricity, like I said, a lot of the areas in different states in Mexico have good winds. That means there's a lot of potential there. With the private sector getting involved, and we're trying to promote this, get the incentives for the private sector to get involved in Mexico and produce that energy. What is going to help us is lower the cost of the energy, to be able to compete better with the prices in energy, and investors of the industry will get in different areas in Mexico as well.
It's interesting. The places that we see most distributed solar growth in the U.S. are places with very high electricity prices, right? Because people install it to cut their bill. I don't, frankly, know much about the prices in Mexico for electricity. Do you think, are they high enough that well, I guess they haven't really stimulated distributed solar yet, but are you saying the price is going to have to come down a little bit more for that to pencil out for the average homeowner?
Yes, they're going to go down because right now there's only the control of CFE. But once the private sector gets involved, now with the new regulations, the private can create their own electricity and apply it to their industry. That's going to help a whole lot to lower the cost, and also the gas. The gasoline prices are higher than the gas. So once we transformed all those plants, we'll be able to have a lower cost of the electricity, and that's going to help the economy as well in Mexico.
Fantastic, fantastic. Ron, I want to turn to you and give you really the same question. What are you seeing? I know it's still earlier stages there, but what are you seeing with distributed solar and other DERs in Israel?
Yes. As you know, the cost of panels all around the world is getting down and down. And these days, the cost of electricity from solar in Israel is rather similar to the, let's say, traditional power supplies. So we have an increased amount of solar. Still in Israel, we control the quantities. Different from the States, you cannot connect a solar system to the grid without the permission of the utility. So we control the quotas, and therefore it is still rather a good situation, but it is growing and growing, and it will be difficult to control it. It has some advantages. I think it will reduce the need for transmission and distribution lines, and the cost for development of the electricity system will be reduced, and it is important. I think in the future, let's say 10 years from now, we will not see anymore the big power plants of hundreds megawatts, and we will see only distributed energy storage energy, and we have to be prepared. Our control rooms, the EMS and DMS, the control rooms that control the transmission and distribution, are preparing themselves for the new situation. It will take time. All the vendors are searching for solutions, and it is a very interesting subject to deal with.
Very interesting, very interesting. Well, American contingency, I know you guys come from states with relatively low electricity prices and not a whole lot of penetration of distributed solar. But I know you guys are dealing with other DERs, and people are adopting CHP, some people are adopting storage for things like that. Can you give us a little overview of what you're seeing with DERs in your areas? Whoever wants to go first.
We're certainly seeing that, and I'd echo the point that I think often people think of it as a rooftop solar issue to start out, and here not as much. But we're seeing different kinds of generation that are able to serve behind the meter, maybe are able to move around and serve behind the meter. So there's a lot of new technology that's driving it. And from the grid operator's perspective, I guess we'd say it is two issues. One is, from our perspective, it's a visibility question. I mean, to what extent do we know what's out there? Because if you see something and you think you've got 50 megawatts to serve out there, and that was because there was 50 megawatts running behind it. That's not running. Now you have 100, and you didn't know. Things like that. So it's visibility questions that are not easy to solve because they involve a lot of players. Transmission into distribution. It's not usually a place we've usually been involved. So we're working with the market to try to figure out the visibility part. But then the second is the market aspect. To what extent can those participants participate as generators in the market, get locational marginal pricing. And that whole set of issues we've been working with our market on for better part of a year, I guess, in a task force, and they're still sort of sorting through, which approaches may make the most sense.
Fantastic. Commissioner Wagner, what about you?
Yeah, I think I was rather, well, maybe we're not unique, but we have a lot of manufacturing. It'll go along with the agriculture. We process a lot of corn and beans and pigs and chickens and all those things. So, we've dealt with distributed generation for a long time because a lot of these plants, the manufacturing plants, have very high needs for staying on. If the plant suddenly goes down, they could be looking at a loss of $1 million in product for shutdown, startup time, all that stuff. So there's several manufacturing. It's not very uncommon to drive across Iowa, see a manufacturing plant, and they've got a standby system out there so that if there is a blip in power or if they lose the power, they can continue running. So I think the utilities in Iowa have been dealing with distributed generation. The difference is now it's going to the individual level. I think utilities across the country are dealing with it. They've dealt with it before. I think what you'll probably see is the utilities kind of turn it back on the DG, and DG has been called a disruptor, and I think they're going to turn it back on them and try to be the disruptor back and say, hey, we know best where to put those solar panels. We know which feeder they'll work on, so we're going to go put them in and offer it to our customers. So I think you're going to see some of that kind of play out. At least that's my sense of where things are going.
Are you giving us the drop about a new utility-owned rooftop solar offering in the state of Iowa?
No. But we've had our utilities come in and give presentations on what they would like to see for different rate design, but have also indicated that, they're looking at some of those projects.
Fantastic. Well, we've only got a few minutes left here, and I could keep asking questions all day, but I'd love to open it up to the audience. If any of you have questions for the panel here, or if any of you are, another member of our international contingency here at ETS16, and would just like to give us a short overview of what's going on in your nation, I think we would all appreciate that as well. Does anyone out there have any questions or any comments?
Maybe we can see the audience.
Actually, I was very pleased to hear you state that there is a positive effect of DER when it comes to reduced distribution and transmission costs. That's something that I think we haven't heard a lot about from the American panelists throughout the conference this week. And I'd like to actually hear from the others on the panel your thoughts on, are we giving enough credit to that positive side of DER? Are we balancing that out against obviously the disruption and the negative pieces, but specifically the positive being potential, probably location specific, but potential to reduce transmission and distribution costs? Thank you.
Non-wire alternatives, Commissioner Wagner.
Well, I think in Iowa we haven't seen that because we need the transmission for the wind. But I think you're correct. I think there are costs and benefits, and that's the million-dollar question: is how do you correctly value the costs and how do you correctly value the benefits? We've seen Minnesota's been valued study, Austin, values solar studies, California. So they're out there. It's just a matter of getting that data, and then, I suppose from some perspectives, it's our role as regulators to determine what those values are and if they're correct, and what they should be. But I think you're absolutely right. It's just a matter of getting those values and what are they. And it's not easy. It's not, because you have one side that says they're worth $1 billion, and you have the other side that says they're costing $1 billion. The answer is probably similar to
I think those potential benefits are why we're going to talk about it. And I think the development of technology that enables additional distributed generation and the potential benefits that can come to customers, to operators, to whomever, is why we're having a debate. But as the commissioner said, it's disruptive to a lot of structures that want to stand and say, well, I want to know how I'm going to be handled in this transition. But I think the idea that there's societal benefit is why we have this discussion in the first place, and why the disruption is made to be what needs to happen.
I think it has to be a balance. The important point is how we're going to benefit the customer. That's the main goal of the energy sector. That's what we need to concentrate on.
Absolutely. I'd just like to point out as well that I had a chance to interview Anne Pruitt, the CEO of ComEd. This was one of the trends that she pointed out to me, is that she thought that commissions all around the country were going to get a lot more stringent when you propose a new capital project. Well, did you look at the alternatives? How many did you look at? Do you really need that line? Do you really need to upgrade that gas plant? Or can we do this with demand-side management and DER? So that was a vote of confidence for her, and I was happy to be able to write about that. So I think the trend is certainly going in that direction for what I can see. So without further ado, let's hear it for this great all-star panel. Thank you, guys.